The winter of 1962 arrived early in Tucker County, West Virginia. By mid-November, snow had already blanketed the Allegheny Mountains, turning the dense forests into a frozen wilderness that stretched for miles in every direction. The small logging town of Parsons, population barely 3,000, sat nestled in a valley where the Cheat River cut through the landscape like a dark vein. Most of the men in town worked either at the lumber mill or in the coal mines that dotted the surrounding hills. It was hard work that kept families fed through the long Appalachian winters, and nobody complained. They simply did what needed to be done. Thomas Brennan was one of those men. At 34 years old, he had worked at the Kingswood Lumber Company for nearly 15 years, operating the same industrial saw that his father had operated before him. Thomas lived in a modest two-bedroom house on Maple Street with his wife, Margaret, and their two children, Sarah, who was 9, and Daniel, who had just turned 7. Their life was simple but stable. Margaret worked part-time at the general store, and on Sundays they attended services at the Baptist church on the corner of Main Street. They were ordinary people living ordinary lives in a town where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were hard to keep. But in late November, something changed. Thomas started coming home later than usual. Margaret noticed it first, the way he would sit at the kitchen table long after dinner, staring at nothing in particular, his food barely touched. When she asked him what was wrong, he would shake his head and say he was just tired. The mill had been demanding lately, he explained. They were pushing to meet quotas before the heavy snows made logging impossible. Margaret wanted to believe him, but she could see the tension in his shoulders, the dark circles forming under his eyes. Something was troubling her husband, something he refused to talk about. The other workers at the mill noticed it too. Thomas had always been reliable, a steady presence on the floor who kept the machines running and the work moving forward. But now he seemed distracted, even jumpy. His coworker, Frank Sullivan, mentioned it one afternoon as they loaded freshly cut timber onto trucks. Thomas had dropped a stack of boards, something he never did, and then stood there for a full minute just staring at the tree line beyond the mill yard. Frank had called his name twice before Thomas snapped out of it. What Frank and the others did not know was that Thomas had seen something in the woods. It had happened 3 days earlier, during a routine survey of timber stands about 6 miles northeast of town. Thomas and 2 other men had driven up an old logging road to mark trees for the next cutting cycle. The forest was thick there, old-growth hemlock, and oak that had stood for decades. The silence among those trees was profound, broken only by the crunch of snow under their boots and the occasional call of a crow. They had been working for about an hour when Thomas noticed the smell. It was faint at first, just an unpleasant tang in the cold air, like meat left too long in the sun. He dismissed it initially, thinking maybe they had passed near a dead deer or some other animal that had succumbed to the cold. But as they moved deeper into the forest, the smell grew stronger, more pungent, until it became almost unbearable. His companions noticed it too. One of them, a younger man named Eddie, suggested they head back. There was something wrong about that smell, something that made the hair on the back of Thomas's neck stand up. But before they could turn around, Thomas saw it. Through the trees, about 50 yards ahead, something was moving. At first, he thought it was a bear, maybe a large one foraging before hibernation. But the movement was wrong. It was too deliberate, too calculated. Whatever it was, it moved on 2 legs, not 4. Thomas stood frozen, watching as the figure weaved between the trees. It was tall, impossibly tall, with limbs that seemed too long for its body. Its skin, if it could be called that, was grayish and stretched tight over protruding bones. Even from that distance, Thomas could see the unnatural way it moved, like something that had forgotten how to walk properly. Eddie saw it too. He grabbed Thomas's arm and whispered urgently that they needed to leave. Now, the third man, an older logger named Carl, had already started backing toward the truck. Thomas wanted to move, wanted to run, but his legs would not obey. He stood there, watching as the creature, because that was the only word that fit, turned its head in their direction. For a brief moment, Thomas could have sworn it was looking directly at him. Then it disappeared into the shadows of the forest, moving with a speed that should not have been possible for something so large. They did not speak on the drive back to the mill. When they arrived, Carl immediately went to the foreman's office and quit on the spot. He packed his tools, got in his truck, and left town that same day. Eddie tried to convince himself they had seen a sick bear, or maybe just shadows playing tricks in the dim forest light. But Thomas knew better. He had seen its eyes. They were human eyes, filled with a hunger that made his stomach turn. Thomas did not report what he had seen. Who would believe him? In a town like Parsons, where logic and hard work were valued above all else, talking about monsters in the woods was a sure way to become the subject of ridicule. So he kept quiet, went to work each day, and tried to forget. But the image of that creature haunted him. At night, he would lie awake, listening to the wind howl through the valley, and wonder if it was still out there, moving through the darkness. Margaret grew increasingly worried. Her husband had always been a rock, someone she could depend on no matter what. But now he seemed fragile, almost breakable. She confided in her neighbor, Helen Morris, who lived 2 houses down with her husband and teenage son. Helen suggested that Thomas might be dealing with stress from work, or perhaps he was coming down with something. The flu had been making its rounds through town, after all. Margaret nodded and thanked her for the advice, but deep down she knew it was something more. The first disappearance happened on December 1st. A local hunter named Robert Hayes went out early in the morning to check his trap lines in the hills west of town. He was an experienced outdoorsman who knew those mountains better than most, having grown up exploring every ridge and hollow. When he did not return by evening, his wife, Louise, called the sheriff's office. Sheriff William Dockery was a practical man in his mid-50s who had served as the law in Tucker County for nearly 20 years. He organized a search party that set out at first light the next morning. They found Robert's truck parked at the end of a dirt road that led up into the highlands. His rifle was still in the gun rack, and his pack was sitting on the passenger seat. The only sign of disturbance was the driver's door, which had been left hanging open. The search party fanned out from the vehicle, calling Robert's name and scanning the snow for tracks. What they found instead made several of the men visibly uncomfortable. The tracks led away from the truck and into the forest, but they were not normal. Robert's boot prints were clearly visible in the snow, deep and evenly spaced, indicating he had been walking at a normal pace. But alongside his tracks were others, larger, with an elongated stride that suggested something bipedal, but not quite human. The prints were deep, as if whatever made them carried significant weight, and there were only 4 toes visible instead of 5. The search party followed the tracks for nearly a mile, deeper into increasingly dense forest, until they simply stopped. Not faded or obscured by wind, just stopped, as if Robert and whatever he had been walking with had simply vanished into thin air. The men searched the surrounding area for hours, but found nothing else. No signs of struggle, no blood, no torn clothing. Just those impossible tracks ending in the middle of a clearing. Sheriff Dockery stood in that clearing for a long time, staring at the ground, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He had dealt with missing persons before, hunters who got turned around, hikers who misjudged the weather. But this was different. This was something he could not explain. The search continued for 3 more days, expanding to cover nearly 10 square miles of forest. Volunteers from surrounding towns joined the effort, including state police, and even a few National Guard members who happened to be stationed nearby. They brought in tracking dogs, but the animals refused to follow the trail. Every time they were brought to the spot where the tracks ended, they would whine and pull backward, their ears flat against their heads. One dog, a bloodhound with years of experience, simply sat down and would not move. His handler had never seen anything like it. Robert Hayes was never found. After a week, the search was officially called off. The prevailing theory was that he had somehow fallen into a hidden ravine or been covered by a sudden snowfall, though neither explanation really fit the evidence. The story made the local papers, but it was treated as a tragic accident, the kind of thing that occasionally happened in rural mountain communities. Life went on. But the people of Parsons felt an undercurrent of unease that they could not quite name. Thomas read about Robert's disappearance in the newspaper and felt his blood run cold. He knew. He knew what had happened, even if he could not prove it. That thing he had seen in the woods, it had taken Robert. The realization made him feel sick. He considered going to the sheriff, telling him everything. But what could he say? That he had seen a monster? That it was hunting people? They would think he was crazy. Worse, they might blame him for not speaking up sooner. Instead, Thomas did something else. He went to the library and started researching. Parsons had a small public library that occupied the second floor of the town hall. The collection was limited, mostly donated books and old newspapers. But Thomas found what he was looking for in a volume about regional folklore and Native American legends. There, in a chapter about the Algonquian tribes that had once inhabited the area, he found a description that made his hands shake as he read. The Wendigo, a creature born from the darkest aspects of human nature, from cannibalism and desperation. According to the legends, it was once human but had been transformed through the act of consuming human flesh. The transformation turned it into something monstrous, impossibly tall, emaciated, with an insatiable hunger that could never be satisfied. It was said to roam the northern forests, hunting anyone who crossed its path. The native peoples had feared it above all else, believing that even speaking its name could draw its attention. Thomas sat in the library until closing time, reading everything he could find. Most of it seemed like superstition, stories told to frighten children or explain the unexplainable. But the descriptions matched too closely to what he had seen. The elongated limbs, the gray skin, the way it moved through the forest with unnatural grace. He did not want to believe it. Every rational part of his mind rejected the idea. But he could not ignore what his eyes had shown him. The second disappearance occurred exactly 1 week after Robert Hayes vanished. This time it was a teenager named Jimmy Patterson, a 17-year-old who worked afternoons at his father's garage in town. Jimmy had been walking home from his girlfriend's house around 9 in the evening, a route he had taken dozens of times before. It was only about 6 blocks, mostly along Main Street where the streetlights provided decent visibility. His parents expected him home by 9:30. When he did not arrive, they assumed he had decided to stay longer at his girlfriend's. By midnight, when he still had not shown up, they called Sheriff Dockery. The sheriff organized another search, this time focusing on the route between the girlfriend's house and the Patterson residence. They found Jimmy's jacket on the sidewalk near the corner of Main and 3rd, just 2 blocks from home. The jacket was lying in the middle of the pavement, as if it had been dropped or discarded. There were no signs of struggle, no skid marks from a vehicle, nothing to indicate what had happened. But in the snow beside the road, partially hidden by the shadow of a large oak tree, there were tracks. The same tracks that had been found near Robert Hayes' truck. The town began to panic. One disappearance could be explained away as an accident or misfortune. 2 disappearances, especially one right in town, suggested something far more sinister. Rumors spread quickly through Parsons. Some people speculated that a drifter or escaped convict was responsible. Others whispered about wild animals, though no one could explain what kind of animal would leave tracks like that. Sheriff Dockery held a town meeting at the fire hall, standing before a crowd of frightened and angry residents who demanded answers he could not provide. He assured them that every available resource was being used to find the missing persons and identify what was happening. State police had been called in to assist with the investigation. Patrols would be increased, especially at night. He advised people to travel in groups, keep their doors locked, and report anything unusual immediately. But even as he spoke, Thomas could see the doubt in the sheriff's eyes. Dockery was a man who dealt in facts and evidence, and right now he had neither. He was grasping at explanations that made no sense because the alternative was too disturbing to consider. Thomas knew he had to speak up. That night, after the meeting, he waited until most of the crowd had dispersed and then approached the sheriff. Dockery was standing by his patrol car, looking exhausted and older than his years. When Thomas explained what he had seen in the woods, the sheriff listened without interruption. His expression remained neutral, professional, but Thomas could see the skepticism in his eyes. When Thomas finished, Dockery was quiet for a moment. Then he asked if anyone else had seen this creature. Thomas mentioned Eddie and Carl. But Carl had left town, and Eddie was insisting they had seen a bear. The sheriff nodded slowly and said he would look into it, but his tone suggested he was simply being polite. As Thomas walked away, he heard Dockery sigh heavily, the sound of a man carrying a burden he did not know how to handle. But Dockery was more troubled than he let on. That night, he sat in his office at the station, staring at the photographs they had taken of the tracks. He had seen a lot in his years as sheriff, but these tracks defied explanation. He called in Tom Whitaker, a local biologist who worked for the State Forestry Service. Whitaker examined the photographs and shook his head. The tracks did not match any known animal in the region. The stride length suggested something over 7 feet tall, and the depth indicated significant weight. The toe configuration was unlike anything he had seen. Whitaker suggested they might be dealing with a bear walking upright, which they sometimes did, but even he did not sound convinced. Bears left claw marks, and these prints had none. The shape was wrong, too angular and deliberate. When Dockery asked him point-blank what he thought made these tracks, Whitaker admitted he had no idea. He recommended contacting someone with more specialized knowledge, perhaps a zoologist from one of the universities. Dockery thanked him and said he would consider it, but he knew there was not time for academic consultations. Whatever was out there, it was moving fast. The third disappearance happened 2 days later. This time it was a young woman named Catherine Miller, a nurse at the small clinic on the outskirts of town. She had been working a late shift and left the clinic around 11 at night. Her car was found in the parking lot the next morning, keys still in the ignition, engine running. The driver's door was open, and her purse was on the ground beside the vehicle. Once again, there were tracks in the snow, those same impossible tracks leading away from the car and into the tree line behind the clinic. This disappearance sent the town into full-blown terror. People stopped going out after dark. The mill reduced its hours so workers could leave before sunset. Parents kept their children home from school. The local hardware store sold out of locks, chains, and firearms within 24 hours. Sheriff Dockery received calls from state officials asking what was happening and why 3 people had vanished without a trace in less than 2 weeks. He had no answers for them. Thomas volunteered to join one of the expanded search parties. He felt responsible somehow, as if his silence after seeing the creature had contributed to what was happening. Margaret begged him not to go, but he insisted. He needed to do something, anything, to help stop this nightmare. The search party consisted of about 20 men, including several state troopers and a couple of volunteers from the county emergency services. They set out from the clinic at dawn, following the tracks into the forest. The tracks led them northeast, toward the same area where Thomas had first seen the creature. The forest was silent, unnaturally so. No birds called, no small animals rustled in the underbrush. Just the crunch of snow under their boots and the sound of their own breathing. They followed the tracks for over 2 miles, the trail winding through dense stands of trees and across frozen streams. Then, as before, the tracks simply ended. The men stood in a clearing, looking at the ground where the prints stopped abruptly, and no one spoke. The fear was palpable, a living thing that hung in the air between them. One of the state troopers, a young man named Harris, suggested they split up to cover more ground. Sheriff Dockery immediately vetoed the idea. Whatever was out there, he said, they needed to stay together. They continued searching until late afternoon, but found nothing else. No bodies, no evidence, no signs of where the missing people had gone. As the sun began to set and shadows lengthened between the trees, Dockery ordered everyone back to town. No one argued. The forest felt wrong, hostile in a way that none of them could articulate, but all of them felt. That night, Thomas could not sleep. He lay in bed, listening to the house settle around him, and thought about what he had seen in the forest. The way the tracks just ended, as if the creature could simply disappear. The oppressive silence among those trees, as if the forest itself was afraid. He kept thinking about the old legends he had read, about the Wendigo, and its insatiable hunger. If the stories were true, if such a thing really existed, then more people would disappear. It would not stop. It could not stop. Around 2 in the morning, Thomas got out of bed and went to the kitchen. He made coffee and sat at the table, trying to think logically about an illogical situation. Margaret found him there an hour later, his head in his hands, the coffee untouched and cold. She sat down across from him and took his hand. She told him she knew something terrible was happening, and that whatever it was, they would face it together. Thomas looked at his wife and felt a surge of gratitude for her strength. He told her everything then, about the creature he had seen, about his research into the Wendigo legend, about his fear that they were all in danger. Margaret listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a long moment. Then she said something that surprised him. Her grandmother had been raised by people who still remembered the old stories, the ones that came from before the settlers arrived. She had heard tales about creatures in the woods, things that hunted men. Her grandmother had always said that such creatures were real, that they were warnings about what humans could become if they gave in to their darkest impulses. Margaret had dismissed it as superstition, but now she was not so sure. The fourth disappearance occurred the following night, and this time there was a witness. George Hendricks, a mechanic who lived on the eastern edge of town, was out in his yard checking on his dogs around 10 in the evening. His 2 German shepherds had been barking incessantly, which was unusual. When George went outside to quiet them, he saw his neighbor, an elderly man named Arthur Coleman, standing in the street. Arthur was facing away from George, motionless, as if he was looking at something in the darkness beyond the streetlight's reach. George called out to him, asking if everything was all right. Arthur did not respond. Then George saw it, a figure emerging from the shadows between the houses. It was tall, incredibly tall, and moved with a strange, lurching gait. Even in the dim light, George could see that it was not human. Its limbs were too long, its body too thin. It approached Arthur slowly, almost cautiously, and then reached out with one impossibly long arm and touched his shoulder. Arthur turned and walked toward it, as if in a trance, moving alongside the creature as it retreated back into the darkness. George stood frozen in his yard, unable to move or speak, as he watched his neighbor disappear into the night. The whole encounter lasted perhaps 30 seconds, but it felt like an eternity. When he finally regained his senses, George ran inside and called the sheriff's office. By the time Dockery arrived, there was no sign of Arthur Coleman or the creature. But George's dogs were still barking, cowering in their kennel, and the mechanic himself was visibly shaken, his hands trembling as he recounted what he had seen. This time, Sheriff Dockery knew they were dealing with something beyond normal law enforcement capabilities. He made a call to the state capitol, requesting assistance from any agency that might be equipped to handle the situation. He did not know exactly what to ask for: military support, wildlife experts, or something else entirely. All he knew was that his town was being terrorized by something that should not exist, and people were dying, or disappearing, which might be worse. The response came faster than expected. 2 days later, a group of men arrived in Parsons. They came in unmarked vehicles and wore no identifying badges or uniforms. Their leader, a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Garrett, met with Sheriff Dockery in private. What they discussed was never made public, but afterward Dockery looked even more troubled than before. He issued a statement asking all residents to remain indoors after sunset until further notice. The town was effectively under an unofficial curfew. Thomas heard about the mysterious visitors and felt a mixture of relief and dread. Relief that someone was finally taking the situation seriously, dread about what it meant that such serious measures were being taken. He went to the sheriff's office and asked to speak with Mr. Garrett. He was told to wait, and after about an hour, he was ushered into a small conference room where Garrett sat with 2 other men. They listened as Thomas described what he had seen in the woods and what he had learned about the Wendigo legend. Mr. Garrett's expression remained neutral throughout, but Thomas could tell the man was paying close attention to every word. When Thomas finished, Garrett asked several specific questions about the creature's appearance, its movements, and the exact location of the sighting. Then he thanked Thomas for his cooperation and said they would be in touch if they needed additional information. Thomas was escorted out, feeling like he had just been debriefed by someone with far more authority than a local sheriff. That night, residents of Parsons saw lights in the forest. Not flashlights or lanterns, but large, powerful spotlights that swept across the tree line and illuminated the hills around the town. Helicopters could be heard in the distance, though none were visible. Whatever operation was underway, it was being conducted with military precision. People stayed in their homes, watching through windows, wondering what was happening in the darkness beyond their town. Thomas stood on his porch, watching those distant lights, and felt a knot of anxiety in his stomach. Part of him hoped that whatever force had been brought in would solve the problem, would capture or kill the creature and end the nightmare. But another part of him, the part that had looked into those human eyes in the forest, knew that this was not going to end cleanly. The Wendigo, if that was truly what they were dealing with, was not just some animal that could be hunted down. It was something else, something born from human darkness, and that made it far more dangerous than anyone wanted to admit. By morning, the lights were gone and the helicopters had departed. Mr. Garrett and his men remained in town, setting up a temporary command center in the old community building on First Street. They brought in equipment, cameras, sensors, things Thomas did not recognize, and began a systematic survey of the surrounding forest. Patrols were established, armed men walking the perimeter of the town day and night. For the first time since the disappearances began, people started to feel a small measure of safety. But that safety was an illusion, and it would not last long. The fifth disappearance shattered whatever fragile sense of security Mr. Garrett's team had managed to create. One of his own men, a specialist named Morrison, vanished while on patrol. It happened during the afternoon, in broad daylight, less than a quarter-mile from the town center. Morrison had been checking one of the sensor arrays they had placed along the forest perimeter when radio contact was lost. His partner, who had been only 50 yards away, heard a brief, sharp cry, and then nothing. By the time backup arrived, Morrison was gone. The scene was disturbingly familiar. His equipment lay scattered on the ground, radio, flashlight, sidearms still holstered. The snow showed those same impossible tracks, leading away from the site and into the trees. But this time there was something new. Blood. Not much, just a few drops on the snow, but enough to suggest that Morrison had been injured or had fought back. Mr. Garrett's expression, normally impassive, showed genuine concern as he examined the scene. The loss of one of their own changed everything. Garrett issued new orders immediately. No one went anywhere alone, not even in town. Patrols were increased to 4-man teams, all heavily armed. The sensor network was expanded, creating a grid that covered nearly 15 square miles around Parsons. If anything larger than a deer moved through that area, they would know about it. But despite these measures, everyone could feel the situation spiraling beyond their control. Thomas watched all of this unfold with a growing sense of dread. The creature was not being deterred by the presence of armed men or sophisticated equipment. If anything, it seemed emboldened, moving closer to town, taking people in increasingly brazen circumstances. He thought about the Wendigo legend, about how the creature's hunger could never be satisfied. Each person it took only made it stronger, more desperate for the next victim. If that was true, then no amount of firepower would stop it. The Wendigo was not just a predator. It was a curse made flesh. Margaret insisted they leave town, pack up the children, and go stay with her sister in Charleston until this nightmare ended. Thomas was tempted. Every instinct told him to get his family as far away from Parsons as possible. But where would they go? The creature had already demonstrated it could strike anywhere, even in the middle of town with armed patrols nearby. Running might just mean dying somewhere else. At least here, they had walls, locks, and people watching out for each other. That night, Thomas sat with Sarah and Daniel in the living room, trying to maintain some semblance of normalcy. They played board games and drank hot chocolate while the wind howled outside. The children knew something was wrong, everyone in town did, but Thomas tried to keep them from being too frightened. He told them it was just a dangerous animal that the police were hunting, and soon everything would be back to normal. Sarah, who was old enough to sense when adults were not telling the whole truth, looked at him skeptically but said nothing. Around midnight, the sensors detected movement. Multiple contacts, moving through the forest from the northeast, converging on the town perimeter. Mr. Garrett mobilized every available person, sending teams to intercept whatever was approaching. Thomas heard the commotion and went to his window, watching as vehicles raced through the streets and armed men took up positions at key locations. The tension was unbearable, everyone waiting to see what would emerge from the darkness. But nothing came. The contacts on the sensors moved in circles, weaving through the forest in patterns that made no sense. When the teams reached the locations where the movement had been detected, they found nothing but tracks. Hundreds of tracks, crisscrossing the snow in chaotic patterns, as if the creature had been running in circles deliberately. It was toying with them, demonstrating that it knew about the sensors and was not afraid. The realization was chilling. By mid-December, 7 people had disappeared from Parsons, and the town was dying. Businesses closed because owners were too afraid to open. The school shut down indefinitely. Families who could afford to leave did so, loading their possessions into cars and trucks and driving away, many vowing never to return. Those who remained did so either because they had nowhere else to go or because they refused to abandon their homes. The population had been cut nearly in half within 2 weeks. Sheriff Dockery looked like he had aged 10 years. He barely slept, spending his nights coordinating with Mr. Garrett's team and trying to maintain some semblance of order. But the truth was that order had broken down. People were terrified, and terror made them unpredictable. There had been incidents, shots fired at shadows, neighbors accusing each other of being responsible for the disappearances, near riots at the few stores still open as people fought over supplies. The social fabric that held the community together was unraveling. Thomas continued his research, spending every spare moment in the library or talking to anyone who might know about the old stories. He spoke with an elderly woman named Martha Wickham, whose mother had been part Cherokee. Martha remembered hearing stories as a child about creatures that hunted in the winter, things that wore human faces but had lost their souls. She told Thomas that such beings could not be killed by ordinary means. Fire was the only thing they truly feared, fire and the breaking of their physical form. Armed with this knowledge, Thomas went to Mr. Garrett and shared what he had learned. Garrett listened carefully, his expression unreadable. When Thomas finished, the man was quiet for a long moment. Then he admitted that nothing they had tried was working. Standard tracking methods failed because the creature seemed to understand them. Weapons had not been effective because they could not corner it long enough to use them. If Thomas's research suggested fire, then perhaps it was worth trying. Plans were made to create a trap. They would use one of the abandoned houses on the edge of town as bait, rigging it with flares, incendiary devices, and enough accelerant to turn the structure into an inferno if needed. Mr. Garrett's team set up observation posts around the property, with clear lines of sight and heavy weapons at the ready. Then they waited, hoping the creature would take the bait and give them an opportunity to strike. 2 nights passed with no activity. On the 3rd night, just after 10, the sensors detected movement approaching the trap house. Everyone tensed, weapons ready, eyes straining to see through the darkness. The temperature had dropped below 0, and the air was so cold it hurt to breathe. Then they saw it, a tall figure moving between the houses, its elongated limbs casting impossible shadows in the moonlight. It approached the trap house slowly, cautiously, as if sensing the danger. For a moment, it seemed like the plan might work. The creature moved closer, almost within range of the prepared firing positions. But then it stopped. It turned its head, looking directly at one of the observation posts where 3 men crouched with rifles. Even from a distance, Thomas, who was watching from a command vehicle, could see the intelligence in that gaze. The creature knew it was a trap, and instead of fleeing, it did something no one expected. It screamed. The sound was unlike anything Thomas had ever heard, a mixture of human agony and animal rage that seemed to vibrate in his chest. The scream went on for nearly 10 seconds, echoing off the buildings and mountains around them, before finally cutting off into silence. Then the creature turned and disappeared into the darkness, moving with such speed that by the time anyone could react, it was gone. The men in the observation posts reported feeling paralyzed during those 10 seconds, as if the scream had robbed them of the ability to move. The failed trap had consequences. That same night, 2 more people disappeared from opposite ends of town, taken simultaneously in what could only have been coordinated attacks. The realization that there might be more than one creature was devastating. All their planning, all their assumptions, had been based on hunting a single entity. If there were multiple Wendigos, or if the creature could somehow be in 2 places at once, then they were facing something far worse than anyone had imagined. Mr. Garrett called an emergency meeting with Sheriff Dockery, Thomas, and several other key individuals. The situation had reached a critical point. They could no longer protect the town effectively, and more people were going to die if they stayed. Garrett recommended a full evacuation. Get everyone out of Parsons immediately and establish a quarantine zone around the entire area until they could bring in additional resources to deal with the threat. Dockery reluctantly agreed. There was no other choice. The evacuation was announced the following morning. Buses were brought in from surrounding counties to transport those without vehicles. People were told to take only essential belongings and to be ready to leave by sunset. The mood was a mixture of relief and despair. Relief at finally escaping the nightmare. Despair at abandoning their homes and community. Thomas helped organize the evacuation, making sure families with children were prioritized and that the elderly had assistance getting to the buses. As the day progressed, Thomas felt increasingly uneasy. The evacuation was proceeding smoothly, perhaps too smoothly. The creature had been aggressive, taking people regularly, and now suddenly there was no sign of it. The forest around town was quiet, the sensors detecting nothing unusual. It felt like the calm before a storm, and Thomas could not shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. By late afternoon, most of the town had been evacuated. Only a few dozen people remained, emergency personnel, Mr. Garrett's team, and some residents who refused to leave. Thomas had convinced Margaret and the children to go on one of the early buses. They were safe, heading south toward Charleston, and that gave him some measure of comfort. He had stayed behind to help with the final phases of the evacuation and to see this through to whatever end awaited. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the empty streets, the sensors suddenly came alive. Contacts everywhere, dozens of them, moving through the forest from all directions and converging on the town. Mr. Garrett ordered everyone to fall back to the community center, the most defensible building in Parsons. They had perhaps 15 minutes before whatever was coming reached them. Thomas ran through the streets with the others, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Fear giving him speed he did not know he possessed. Behind him, he could hear sounds in the darkness, footsteps that were not quite right, breathing that was too labored and too close. He did not look back. He just ran, praying he would reach the community center before whatever was chasing him caught up. They barricaded themselves inside, 23 people in total, while outside the sounds grew louder. Scratching at the doors, at the windows. Shadows moving past, too tall and too thin to be human. And that smell, the putrid stench of decay that Thomas had first encountered in the forest weeks ago. It filled the air, making everyone gag. Mr. Garrett positioned his men at the windows and doors, weapons ready, while everyone else huddled in the center of the building, waiting to see what the night would bring. The siege lasted until dawn. For 8 hours, they endured the sounds of things moving around the building, testing the doors and windows, scratching at the walls. Occasionally, a face would appear at a window, pale, emaciated, with eyes that held terrible intelligence and hunger. Mr. Garrett's men fired at these apparitions, but the bullets seemed to have little effect. The faces would disappear, only to reappear moments later at a different window. Thomas spent those hours in a state of numb terror, unable to fully process what was happening. At some point during the night, Sheriff Dockery admitted that he had authorized a photographer from the State Archive Division to document everything. The man, a professional named Kenneth Barnes, had been taking photographs since the first disappearance. pictures of the tracks, the abandoned belongings, the fear in people's faces. And now, trapped in the community center, he continued his work, capturing images of the creatures outside, of the armed men firing uselessly into the darkness, of the terrified civilians praying for morning. When dawn finally came, the attacks stopped abruptly. The scratching ceased, the shadows retreated, and an eerie silence fell over the town. Mr. Garrett cautiously sent men outside to investigate. What they found was horrifying. The streets were covered in tracks, as if dozens of the creatures had been circling the building throughout the night. But there were no bodies, no physical evidence beyond the tracks, and some damage to the building's exterior where they had tried to force entry. Kenneth Barnes had captured it all on film. Over 200 photographs documenting the entire nightmare, from the initial disappearances through the failed evacuation and the siege of the community center. He showed some of them to Mr. Garrett, and even that stoic man seemed shaken by what the images revealed. The creatures were visible in the photographs in ways they had not been to the naked eye, their forms more solid, more detailed. It was proof, undeniable proof, that something inhuman was stalking the mountains of West Virginia. Within hours, federal authorities arrived in force. Military personnel secured the area, and everyone who had been in Parsons was taken away for debriefing. Thomas found himself in a windowless room, being questioned by men in suits who wanted to know every detail of what he had seen. He told them everything, holding nothing back. When he asked what would happen to the photographs, he was told they would be preserved as part of an official investigation, but classified for national security reasons. Thomas never saw those photographs again. Kenneth Barnes, the photographer, was escorted away and later signed documents preventing him from ever discussing what he had captured on film. The official story released to the press was that a series of tragic accidents and a possible wildlife threat had necessitated a temporary evacuation of Parsons. No mention was made of the Wendigo or the supernatural nature of the attacks. The photographs were sealed in a vault beneath the West Virginia State Capitol, marked restricted indefinitely, and locked away from public view. Thomas reunited with his family in Charleston 3 days later. They never returned to Parsons. The town was officially abandoned, deemed unsafe for habitation due to environmental hazards. The government purchased all the properties at fair market value, and gradually the place was forgotten, becoming just another ghost town in the Appalachian Mountains. But Thomas never forgot. He carried the memory of those terrible weeks with him for the rest of his life, knowing that something evil still lurked in those forests, waiting for the next winter, the next desperate soul to cross its path. The photographs remain sealed to this day, hidden away in their vault, a silent testimony to a nightmare that the government decided the world was not ready to see. Sometimes, when winter comes and the snow falls heavy on the mountains, there are still reports from hikers and hunters of strange tracks in the woods, of figures moving between the trees that are too tall and too thin to be human. But these reports are dismissed, filed away, forgotten. Because acknowledging the truth would mean admitting that some nightmares are real, that some hungers can never be satisfied, and that in the deep forests of Appalachia, the Wendigo still hunts. Before you wander back into the shadows, make sure you hit that like button to keep these legends alive. Subscribe to the channel so you never miss another chilling tale from the dark corners of North American folklore. And whatever you do, activate the notification bell, because the next story might just be the one that keeps you up tonight. Stay curious. Stay brave.